Good morning, and thanks for the opportunity. For those of you who were at the Breckenridge meeting, there might be a little bit of overlap between my talk here and the talk at that meeting on the large ensemble. This project won the CESM Distinguished Achievement Award, and I think it's a project that's being used by over 50 universities, over 12 countries. The paper has been in press in BAMS for a year and has close to 100 citations. So I think the community was really clamoring for this type of project. And so I'm going to tell you what this project is if you don't know about it, and also just give you some idea of the historical context that it fits into. So yeah, CESM Large Ensemble Project, inspiring new ideas and understanding. And I'll start with just this really basic question. What is it and who made it happen? So we have a paper that's in BAMS that describes the project. This is a project that Clara Desser and I co-led here at NCAR with a number of collaborators. Jean-Francois is up there too. But the idea of this project was really to provide a community resource to enable studying climate change in the presence of internal climate variability. So how do we do that? Well, the strategy is to simulate climate trajectories over a period. We picked 1920 to 2100 multiple times. We've gotten up to 42 times at this point, with small atmospheric initialization differences. So what we've done is we've actually perturbed the air temperature field in CESM, but we've perturbed it at a round-off level, like 10 to the minus 14. If you take the global mean and plot it, you would never see it on any color bar that you ever use. But this kind of small perturbation to the climate system introduces chaos, and the trajectories of these different ensemble members as they go forward in time quickly diverge. So I want to be really clear that this is the only difference between all of these different members. We're using the same model, CESM-1 with the CAM5 atmosphere. We're using the same external forcing, so this is actually specified by the CMIP protocol with one minor exception for the ozone forcing. But we're using the same model and the same forcing, and the only thing we're doing is doing something at 10 to the minus 14th at the beginning of the ensemble. You might say, like, what is the point? You're not going to see very big differences, are you? Well, I think one of the outcomes of this project that's been the most sort of shocking to me is just how different those trajectories can be from something so small at day one. How, you know, in some ensemble members you have sea ice loss like what we observe, and in some ensemble members you have basically no sea ice loss. Like, we're talking over a 30-year period, trajectories that are really different. So I think this is an interesting companion data set to think about when you're analyzing something like CMIP5. I think it probably gives you some perspective that the spread you see in CMIP5 is not entirely due to parameterization differences or physics differences in the models. Some of that spread is due to just variability that exists in the climate system that's simulated by our climate models. And it's not something that's reducible. It's not something that I'm going to improve the clouds in CESM and that's going to make the trajectory in CESM closer to the trajectory in GFDL's model, for example. So sort of the classic picture to show the experimental design is this one, which is figure 2 from the BAMS paper. And it shows the experimental design and does so by plotting just as a function of time the global mean surface temperature anomaly. So you see the 1850 control. We started that the simulation with an 1850 control run, so this just has constant 1850 forcing. We ran it for about 400 years, and we picked a random January 1st. Year 402. There was nothing special about that year. We didn't look at it, we didn't analyze it, we didn't look at AMOC, we just said, let's go, year 402. And we started the first ensemble member following the historical forcing. We went forward to 1920, and 1920 is where we decided to start the large ensemble. So that's where we now have 42 members starting. They all start with slightly different initial conditions from that point. We started in 1920 and not in 1850 because, as you can see, from 1850 to 1920, not that much happens. And we don't have a ton of data there. And this is a big data project. There's a lot of output that's being generated from this, a lot of daily fields. So we wanted to kind of put our money, put our resources where we thought they would be most used. So we started in 1920. You can still see the first ensemble member going forward in time in black. And now you see it's joined by this gray cloud of other ensemble members. You also see the observations that are plotted in red. So one thing that very quickly came out of this project is, how many of you guys have heard of the global warming hiatus? Okay. So what would you think about the global warming hiatus looking at this plot? Is this something that is totally out of the realm of possibility, not something we would ever expect? What would be your interpretation? Even so the comment was, add 2014, 2015, and you don't have a hiatus anymore. Fair enough. But even in the absence of 2014 and 2015, did the ensemble members here suggest that what happened during that hiatus period was abnormal? No, they really suggest it's just part of the cloud of global mean temperature evolution we might expect in a world where there's variability, and that, you know, sometimes the warming rate slows a little bit and sometimes it goes a little faster, and that's just part of the natural variability in the system. And it's not something that is not a conclusion one could draw if you only had one ensemble member, right? It'd be pretty hard to make that kind of argument. So that's one of the sort of first basic results that came out. It's also sort of a sanity check on the model and its ability to reproduce one of the sort of most basic climate variables, the global mean surface temperature as observed. So, there's a lot you can do just by looking at the global mean temperature. I love this plot. So Vineal Yatella, he's a grad student in my group, and he's gotten really interested in predictability. And so he said, I want to look at the beginning of the large ensemble, this plot where you're just showing the global mean temperature over 100 years. Like, I want to see what happened, at the very beginning. So he has looked at the global mean surface temperature in the different ensembles, starting from the very first days of the integration. So you can see over the first 20 days of the integration, these ensemble members are really close to each other, consistent with the fact that, right, they started with only 10 to the minus 14th differences in their air temperature. They all have sort of their mid-latitude dynamics in the same place. They all have it's like a weather forecast, right? But after 20 days or 30 days, you can see that the chaos starts to set in. And just like we know that you can't predict the weather beyond about a month in most cases, these ensemble members are spreading and reach their sort of climatological spread fairly rapidly, within, I would say, 30, 40 days. So this is the beginning of the ensemble, and I think it's a fun plot. Is this what you guys had in your mind when I said small initialization differences and how long it takes for them to spread? Yeah, maybe? You surprised it took that long? Yeah. Okay, so this was really a big data project. Running all of these ensemble members was a lot of energy and a lot of time, a lot of computing resources. It was over 10,000 simulated years. It was all done on Yellowstone, which is the same platform I understand you guys are using this week. It took about 3 weeks to run each ensemble member, so the whole project took over a year to complete. And many terabytes, approaching the petabyte scale of post-process raw output. So it really kind of pushed a lot of CESM, and I think it's really prepared us in a lot of ways for sort of the CMIP 6, the sort of next steps, and because it just seems like in climate modeling, everything just keeps getting bigger and more, and you just kind of always got to keep up with things. So this was an opportunity also in between CMIP 5 and CMIP 6 for the project to kind of work through its workflows and understand how to work with really big data. So this project had many contributions from many people, and I just put some of their faces up here because it's nice to see the human face of a project like this. It took a lot of energy, but it's really, really gratifying to see how much it's been used. we started just by writing on whiteboards to try to figure out, these decisions about 1920 is a time to start. These are the kinds of things we really solicited community input on. We also solicited a lot of community input on the variables that we saved. There are many daily variables that are available. And that is something that's quite different than CMIP. So there's opportunities to look at extremes and things like that. There's restarts saved. So if you ever wanted to look at a particular period, you could look at it in all 40 members, but not have to run from 1920 forward. You could just start in the year 2000 or something. So yeah, we did a lot of looking at the outputs. Support from the leadership was essential. Here's a couple quotes, just so you get a sense of what it's like to run a project like this. So here's Marika Holland, who was the chief scientist at the time, writing to Dave Hart, who I understand gave a presentation to you guys also this week. We are now in a position to start simulations that we have allocated under community projects. Would it be possible to obtain project space for these community project runs? So, and then Andy Mai, who is one of the scientists here who ran a number of these simulations, he noticed that the space is now listed, and he took the GLADE quota command. Have you guys used GLADE quota? It tells you how much space you have in your directories and stuff. He says it's 400 terabytes rather than 50. That's more like it. So this is the kind of thing we were kind of fumbling our way through as you try to figure out how to deal with this much data. So yeah, we ate cake. We did things like delete files, which was a little scary, but everything was saved as a single variable time series, just like CMIP. But the standard way that things come out of CESM is monthly mean with all variables in one location. So we had to make some important decisions about how to use the finite space that we had. We had 7 ensemble members that were run at the University of Toronto, this was a nice contribution from an external international collaborator, although Paul is very involved in the CESM project. So that was nice. One thing that's sort of interesting and kind of a side note is that just this week we're starting to see that there are some really small differences between these runs and the runs that were run on Yellowstone. And we think this might be related to the compilers that were being used on the 2 machines. So even though we're running the same code, we have the same experiments, some small differences. This is the kind of thing that a large ensemble project would expose that you never would have seen before. You just never would have had the ensemble members to see that the compilers might be slightly interpreting things differently on the University of Toronto supercomputers versus the Yellowstone supercomputers. I want to be really clear that this has a minor impact on the simulations. I mean, you saw the cloud of points. They're all within each other, but it is something that's an interesting side note. Do you have a comment here?
Yeah, we like
Yep. Yeah, it's for most of your analysis, I think this is not something that would probably have any impact. But I think from the context of thinking about compilers, like that's something I would have always taken for granted. And yeah. They are flagged as different, and so if you are concerned about this type of thing, just use all the members that were run on Yellowstone. So, but I can talk offline if people are interested in that, but that's sort of an active development over the last couple of weeks. It took a statistics professor to find the difference. All of us climate scientists were just like happy I'm going along using this, but didn't notice it, but he flagged that as a small difference. So yeah, these are big codes, right? It's like 1.5 million lines of computer code. Big computers, like lots of compiler options, flags. Like this is a complex beast we're talking about here. There's analogs to the simple Lorentz equations and how they're solved, but this is a really complex environment. There's been a lot of interest from all kinds of different folks. The Pepsi Challenge is an example of one of the spin-off projects. It's not a climate science project. It's more a question about big data. So what scientists here at NCAR, John Dennis, Allison Baker, have done is they've compressed some of the large ensemble output. And so therefore, there's less need for disk space to store it. But they were curious, could a climate scientist see the difference? You know, like, do you need 10 to the 14 precision for every variable, or will 10 to the 6 do just fine? And this paper has already been submitted to GMD. One of the interesting things that came out is that this plot here, the chaos at the beginning, this was one of the places where this very small difference in compression was actually very robustly detected. So yeah, that's another interesting project. Again, I think for most people in the room, if you're using the large ensemble and you see some difference, definitely let us know. But for most climate analyses, I don't think that anything has come out from having 6 significant digits versus 14 significant digits. So. Okay. So that just gives you a general sense of this project, kind of the environment it exists in, this big data, kind of big computer, lots of output, lots of interests project. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about just some general uses and applications of the large ensemble project. One of the most basic ones is to just find the forced response in the presence of internal climate variability. So it's a really simple equation. You can think of any one of these trajectories, any one of these ensemble members. Their climate history is really a sum of 2 things. It's a sum of the internal variability, which is unique to that member, and the forcing, right? So something that they all share. So in order to find what the forcing is, you can just average over all of the ensemble members, and then you reduce all of the internal variability because it's all random, it should cancel, and you're left with just the forced signal. So it's a really robust way of estimating what the forced response is. So that can be useful for interpreting observed trends. So you can talk about what fraction of a trend might be related to the forced signal versus the internal climate variability. You can also think about that in terms of time of emergence of a forced or an anthropogenic component to a signal. And both of these types of concepts, there's been a number of applications from the large ensemble, everything from detecting oxygen levels in the ocean to Arctic sea ice trends. There's plenty of variables that haven't been looked at, so definitely think about those kinds of things. You also have a really robust characterization of the internal variability when you have so many different members, right? You can really characterize extreme events much better than you could if you just had 1 or even 5 members, and look at distributions instead of just single trajectories. So that's something you can, of course, do from CMIP as well, but here it's very clear that the source of the spread in your PDF or the extreme events, that if new ones are occurring, that it's related to just internal variability and forcing, not related to differences in the model physics. We have a hierarchy of runs. So this is very nice for testing sort of physical understanding. So we have the fully coupled runs that have an active dynamic ocean circulation, an active dynamic atmosphere circulation, and an active dynamic land. We have a slab ocean simulation that's it's even longer, I think, than up here now. So this just has a thermodynamic ocean. So if you want to test what is the influence of ocean circulation on the climate system, you can just compare these two and look at the variability in the 2 of them and see, oh, wow, like weather over Boulder is really dominated by atmosphere variability noise, and it doesn't really matter if you have a dynamic ocean. We also have atmosphere-only simulations. So these are where basically the ocean is just a prescribed constant SST and sea ice pattern that has seasonal variation, but is not robustly coupled or at all coupled to the atmosphere above. So this lets you test a lot of hypotheses, and I think this type of framework really helps build physical understanding. And I've certainly used comparing these different types of things to assess, for example, the role of deep ocean circulation in the climate system. There's also a number of additional other experiments. Yeah. Yeah.
So Oracle ensemble.
Yeah.
Was from the fully coupled, or
it's from the fully coupled. Yeah.
So that's a bunch of separate from the 1920s.
These are all just, yeah, sorry, I should have been really explicit. These are all just with the 1850. So if you want to look at variability and what controls variability, you can do it in the absence of forcing. You could also do these types of experiments integrating forward in time, like the atmosphere only. That's like your standard AMIP type of run. But here, because it's just 1850, I think this is just a framework to look at variability in the absence of forcing and what kind of the underlying physical mechanisms might be for generating it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the first ensemble member comes out of that fully coupled control run, but the other two are just kind of companion simulations. There's a question in the back, yeah. These runs have constant 1850 forcing. So it's the same forcing year after year after year after year, but there's variability in it. It has, El Nino events, it has decadal variability, and so you can analyze these and get a sense of what controls the variability. And you could compare these. For example, you could compare the fully coupled variability to the variability in the 42 ensemble members and see how climate change is changing variability. And you'd be able to do so in a really nice framework, right? Because you have a lot of ensemble members in the future, and you have a really well-characterized sort of baseline. Does that make sense? Yeah, another question here. Mm-hmm. For the forcing, we haven't done that. So you mean change CO2 or something?
Maybe.
Huh. I mean, the choice of perturbing the atmosphere temperature field is one that we made, but it's not the only one that you could make in order to generate in an ensemble like this. Yeah, so there's a question here. Yeah. 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 It is true that you would get the same answer, and we've shown this with the Toronto ones, by running on a different machine too. So there's nothing special about air temperature. It's just like introducing a small bit of chaos into the system, and then it kind of kicks off the different modes and variability. Yeah. Okay, so there's a comment. The same thing has been done with zonal wind speed. Works the same way. Yeah, question in the back. Yeah. So for the same compiler on the same machine, with the same initial condition, the same exact restart, if you started another ensemble member, you'd get the exact same trajectory. So the exact same random sequence of events. If you change the compiler option, you won't. And if you run on Yellowstone 3 years earlier or 2 years later, you might not, because the compilers change. So it's always a moving target, but that's that kind of test. I'll just repeat it again so everyone can hear. Like, just using the exact same file and the exact same start, trying to get an exact restart so that you follow the exact same climate trajectory. That's the kind of thing that the software engineers do here to test, to make sure that the code is working well. So I know I spent like a week when I was a postdoc, like chasing down some issue related to exact restarts, because when I did that, I wasn't getting an exact restart, and there was something that was not being written right in my restart file. It was when I was working with something that was still under development, but that's something that is definitely checked. It would have been unfortunate if we did that with a large ensemble, but it's more fun to have a little bit of noise. Question here. It is. So there's ocean biogeochemistry and land biogeochemistry. I'm pretty sure for all of them. Yeah. Yes, it doesn't affect the CO2 concentrations. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yes. And there's been some very high-profile papers that have come out from using those results. Galen at the University of Wisconsin had one in Nature. I think Matt Long had one about the oxygen that was also pretty high-profile. So that's an example of something that's kind of novel. Yeah, you can thank Keith Lindsay for that. He spent a lot of time to make that happen. Yeah. Any other questions, as long as we're stopped here? It's kind of fun to hear what you guys are thinking. Yeah. We run it as long as we can. We run it as long as we can.
Well, has run in 10,000 years.
The more those are just as they go. Our goal was to get about 1,000 years for each of them because we wanted enough statistics, but honestly, 10,000 years is better than 1,000 for statistics. And some of the variability that exists in this, if you're looking at centennial scale variability, 1,000 years is only 10 samples. That's not so much. So I think it really depends on the time scale you're interested in. And for most people, the longer the better, I think, in terms of getting robust statistics. I know Gokhan, he's a scientist here. He ran the CESM-4 control run for a really long time, and like he was always talking at lunch. He's like, "Yeah, just have it sitting in economy. It went in today." So he's not like trying to use a lot of computer resources on it, but he's always kind of pushing it forward in time because he knows the longer the better, the more useful it is. So if you see Gokhan, you can thank him too for long control runs. Yeah. So the other thing that's fun about the large ensembles, there's been a number of offshoot projects. So the medium ensemble, there's 15 members with a RCP 4.5. I should have mentioned that the large ensemble was RCP 8.5, so the largest emissions scenario into the future. This is somewhat less emissions scenario, and the two have been compared in a very big project called BRACE to try to understand what the impacts would be of reducing the emissions. There's been efforts to look at perturbed ocean initial conditions, so this kind of goes back to does it matter which variable are perturbed at the beginning? There's been single forcing runs, pacemaker runs, regional downscaling. So there's 6-hourly data that could drive something like WRF. So if you wanted to run something that's just regionally defined model, you have the boundary conditions, the lateral boundary conditions. They could come from the large ensemble. So there's been a lot of work done with it. So this really helps you interpret spread also, as I've kind of already alluded to, in multi-model archives. So CMIP5, the ensemble members that you analyze there, of course, have contributions from both internal climate variability and structural variability in the model. They have different physical parameterizations. So by comparing the two, it gives you some sense of what is the uncertainty that's potentially reducible, you know? Like, internal climate variability isn't going anywhere, right? I mean, ENSO, PDO, that stuff is just part of our climate system. And it's predictable to some extent, but it's definitely never gonna go away. Whereas, you know, differences in how you represent clouds in two different models could have an important influence on the climate trajectories. And so how much of the uncertainty is reducible is really something you could start to analyze or assess by comparing CMIP5 and a large ensemble. Yeah, just kind of this robust characterization of the internal climate variability was really the main goal of this project. I think it also helps you do more informed model evaluation. So when you only run one member, as we saw with the global warming hiatus example, sometimes you don't have a full understanding of what the variability might be. And so then the next natural question, well, how many ensemble members do you actually need? Do you need 40? Or will 5 suffice? It's going around that for sea ice, maybe 10 is pretty good. Alexander Jan has a paper in GRL that's going to come out on that. I want to be really clear that this question is not a one-size-fits-all. How many ensemble members you need will really depend on your science question. If you're thinking about extremes, you know, 42 might not be enough. If you're thinking about global mean temperature, potentially it is. I think this also exposes inherent challenges when you're trying to compare to short observational records, right? Like, we think of the observed Arctic sea ice loss as being a pretty long record. You know, it's like, it's as old as I am almost, you know? Like, yet the ensemble members show that some have very close to that amount of sea ice loss, and some have a lot less than that sea ice loss, and some have even a little bit more. And so it's really humbling to think about how you interpret that and how you explain that in the context of the short observational records we have. Finally, this has also been a really useful reference point for CESM-2 model development, and it's become sort of a new baseline to what we compare to. And I think that's also important because, you know, you could say, oh, this new version of CESM is really different than the last version we had. Well, now we have a robust characterization of what that last version of CESM is. And so we know if CESM2 is kind of within it or outside of it in a really robust kind of way. So it really helps you on kind of this interpretation of nature, this kind of two-way street between models and observations. And I hope none of you leave a workshop on CMIP thinking that that's all you need, right? Like, you need a lot of tools to really understand the environment that's out there. And climate models are one of them. And I would say initial condition climate model ensembles combined with multi-model ensembles provide even more information from a modeling perspective. But it's this two-way street between models and observations where you really ask and interrogate and say, is this model doing something that matches the observations? Why? You know, don't immediately assume the model is wrong. Well, I guess all models are wrong, right? But you know, you have to go back and forth and really have a good physical understanding of what that is. And that's a complicated two-way discussion. That's not just, as I often see it, which is just, oh, the climate model's wrong. Like, let's think about this a little more carefully. So some specific examples. There's a number of different things one could look at. This is just one that's a relatively simple one, and it's from a paper that Clara wrote, where she's really using this this concept of looking at an individual simulation and the observations and saying, oh, wow, cool. Simulation 7 of the large ensemble and the observed air temperature trends over North America looks pretty good, right? You know, the model looks pretty good. Well, what happens when you look at simulation 28? Wow. Remember that the only difference between these two simulations is their 1920 10 to the minus 14th butterflies. So if you were someone who is in Canada, interested in fires and the contribution of warming to fires or something like that, you would be maybe tempted, if you just looked at observed and simulated, to try to attribute all of the warming that you've seen in Canada to forcing. But I think if you look at 28, you start to see, oh no, there's some contribution also of internal climate variability to the actual observed trends. And so if you look at the ensemble mean, this is the forced response. This is what you could actually say, this is what's resulting from the forcing. And you can see maybe it's about half of the observed signal. So, I mean, this kind of plot shocked me when I first, are you guys shocked? Or is this just kind of like, whatever, we know, large ensembles, blah, blah, blah. Like, when I was in grad school, this would have been like shocking for me to see. And maybe even more so with precipitation, because when I was in grad school, it was often discussion about how, models, they do okay for temperature, but they really stink for precipitation. They can't get anything right. No, precipitation trends are just horrible. You look at precipitation, it's even more variable than temperature in some of these ensembles, and it's really humbling. I mean, I'm not saying the models are doing precipitation well, but it's certainly not so easy to just look at trends and say the model is flawed. You have to do something more sophisticated than that. Yeah, comments?
But like, what's the range?
So I think by uncertainty you mean internal climate variability. Is that what you mean?
I mean, if we're saying this is the force,
Yes.
then what are our standard errors on that?
Oh, okay. So
Like, how certain should I be about that?
So the way you would look at that is how the 42 members are converging, because this is just an estimate of the forced response, right? Like if you ran this infinite number of times, you would have the exact, from a statistical framework, right? That would be this is an estimator, right? This is, I think for 42 members, I haven't looked at this for this particular problem, but I think for many things you're starting to converge on a pretty good, I mean, we thought about this in the context of how many members to run, like for statistics, right? Frequently, once you start getting into 40, you can use different statistical methods than when you have really small sample sizes and you're really concerned about your estimate of the mean. Does that make sense? Yeah. And you have a comment on that, or? Right.
Also have to look at
Yes, for sure, this is a simplified framework for trying to do that type of partitioning. And, so Ben brought up that there's uncertainty in the forcing that's being applied here. I would say also this is one model's estimate of the size of the internal climate variability, right? You might want to look at another model to have a sense of what the noise or the internal variability size is. And as we start to get more initial condition ensembles, that will also be possible. So, yeah. Any other question? Yeah.
Is that just a follow-up on that? Has that been well, I have to beat my head against the brick wall.
Yeah. So Ben has a tall order here.
Then you could do a better job.
Yeah. Ben has a really tall order here. And just for a little bit of historical perspective, the reason that we were able to run something like the large ensemble is that when Yellowstone came online, it was a 30-fold increase in our computing power. So all of a sudden, we had a lot more computer time, and doing something like this type of project was possible, right? Like, it's not that people didn't think that initial condition uncertainty is not important. It just was something that wasn't really available for us to look at. Yeah. Okay, so Jean-Francois was telling me I got about 5 minutes, and I'm pretty close to the end here. I just want to show you a couple more examples. Sea ice extent. This is another thing I've mentioned. You know, some members look like the observations, some don't. Here's one that looks a lot like the observations, member 13. What happens at 2020? Oh my gosh, like there's a sea ice recovery. Polar bears are going to be happy. All the oil companies are going to be depressed, you know. And then it just falls off a cliff, right? This would be a PR nightmare if you were an Arctic sea ice scientist. Something like this is, I think, more what people are expecting, right? Like just kind of continued decreases in Arctic sea ice. And yet, remember, these two ensemble members, the only thing that's different is what happened in 1920 on January 1st at the 10 to the minus 14 level. Like, just be aware, it's bigger than I ever thought it would be in terms of how it contributes to what's going on. So this is kind of the heart of what I think is relevant specifically to this workshop. You know, CMIP is really an ensemble of opportunity. You know, as Ben mentioned, it's not doing a systematic job with a lot of things. One thing that it is confounding are the differences in model physics and internal climate variability. And something like an initial condition ensemble really lets you look at the spread due to internal climate variability alone. So I think a question that you should be asking whenever you're doing an analysis with CMIP is, how does CMIP spread compare to just internal climate variability? And you know, you could use the large ensemble, you could use other ensembles, you could even use an 1850 control run, and that would help get at that type of question pretty well. So yeah, it happens. So maybe I'll just leave this here. Like there's a website, which actually I just learned the URL on that is changing. But anyways, if you Google it, you'll find it. There's a BAMS paper that describes the project in detail. And maybe I'll just take any questions. And it's been great to have you guys ask questions through it, too. I think it helps to kind of see what you guys are interested in. And there's some great questions that came up, too. So thanks. Yeah, question.